The smell of the Ozarks isn't pine or fresh rain. It's the stench of a shallow grave exhaling through the limestone. It's the scent of damp earth, wet fur, and the metallic tang of something that died long before I was born. I stood at the edge of the property, my boots sinking into the black, loamy rot of 1,000 fallen leaves. Behind me, the world of paved roads and cell service was a fading memory. In front of me, the campground lay like a sprawling, cancerous growth on the flank of the mountain. The sun was an open wound in the sky, hemorrhaging a deep, sickly orange across the horizon. As it dipped lower, the shadows didn't just lengthen, they sharpened. They became jagged blades of indigo, slicing across the clearing, carving the dilapidated cabins into fragments of dark and light. The deed in my jacket pocket felt heavy, a cold anchor pulling me into a history I never asked for. My uncle, a man whose face I only remembered as a blurred photograph in a funeral program, had left me this. He called it a legacy. To me, it looked like a tomb. The air here doesn't circulate, it stagnates. It sits in your lungs like heavy water, tasting of iron and ancient dust. I made my way toward the main office, a structure of graying cedar that looked like it was being slowly swallowed by the surrounding oaks. The porch groaned under my weight, a high-pitched, splintering sound that cut through the oppressive silence of the woods. There were no birds here, no crickets, just the rhythmic, hollow thud of my own heart and the distant, wet sound of a stream that shouldn't have been there. Inside, the office was a cathedral of neglect. Dust motes danced in the dying light, thick enough to choke on. The furniture was a collection of skeletal remains, chairs with burst stuffing, a desk scarred by cigarette burns. And there, sitting in the absolute center of the desk, was the tape recorder. It was a blocky, plastic relic, its gray casing coated in a fine layer of grime. It looked out of place, yet perfectly at home, like a tooth left on an altar. Beside it lay a single cassette, the brown ribbon of tape visible through the clear casing, coiled like a sleeping viper. I reached out, my fingers trembling. The curiosity was a sharp itch in my brain, a needle prick of desire to know why a man would choose to die in a place where the trees seemed to lean in with such predatory intent. As my hand closed around the cold plastic, the sun finally slipped behind the ridge. The transition was violent. The warm gold evaporated, replaced by a bruised, purple twilight that turned the forest into a wall of solid ink. The shadows grew hungry. They crept across the floorboards, liquid and silent, reaching for my boots. I felt the void of the mountains pressing against the windows, a vast, unthinking pressure that wanted to see what was inside. I slotted the tape into the player. The click of the door closing was as loud as a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. I pressed play. The first thing I heard wasn't a voice. It was static, but it wasn't the clean, white noise of a radio. It was a wet, grinding sound, like teeth chewing on grit. It was the sound of the earth shifting, of limestone grinding against limestone in the dark bellies of the Ozark caves. It was a visceral, guttural hum that vibrated in my teeth. Then, through the layer of electronic rot, came a voice. It was thin, frayed, and sounded like it was being squeezed through a throat filled with silt. It didn't sound like my uncle. It sounded like the woods themselves were trying to speak through his vocal cords. The first warning was a rasp. Do not look at the tree lines when the light fails, the voice whispered, its cadence jagged and broken. The shadows here have a weight, boy. They have a memory. And they are very, very hungry for something new to hold. I looked out the window, and for a terrifying second, I couldn't tell where the trees ended and the sky began. Everything was a jagged, black void, and I was the only light left in the world, guttering like a candle in a gale. The legacy of the Ozarks wasn't land or money. It was the terror of being noticed by things that have been waiting in the dark since the first stone was laid. The cabin smelled of wet fur and ancient, unwashed secrets. My flashlight beam was a dying thing, a jaundiced smear against the heavy, velvet dark of the Ozark night. I stepped over the threshold, and the floorboards didn't just creak, they screamed with the friction of bone on bone. Dust motes danced in my light, fat and grey like the ashes of a burnt life. They swirled in the stagnant air, thick enough to choke on, thick enough to hide the things that shouldn't be there. I found the desk in the corner, a slab of oak so ravaged by termites it looked like lace. And there, sitting in the center of that skeletal wood, was the recorder. It was a heavy, black plastic box, an old reel-to-reel that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. It was caked in a grime that felt greasy to the touch, like rendered fat that had long since gone rancid. My thumb hovered over the play button, the plastic cold and biting against my skin. The silence of the woods outside was a physical weight now. A hand pressed hard against the small of my back, urging me toward the abyss. I pressed down. The click was a gunshot in the stagnant air. Hiss. A long, agonizing stretch of static that sounded like 1,000 insects rubbing their legs together in a frenzied, dry rhythm. It was a jagged sound, a white noise that felt like it was sanding down the inside of my skull. Then, the voice broke through. It didn't sound like Uncle Silas, or at least not the version of him I remembered from the faded Polaroids. It sounded like the wind caught in a throat full of gravel. It was a wet, ragged sound, the voice of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have a tongue, a voice that had been dragged through the thorns and the briars of the hollows before being spat back out into the light. "If you are hearing this," Silas rasped, and the tape hissed with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, "then the dirt has already started to claim you. Don't look at the corners of the room, boy. The shadows here have a way of detaching themselves from the objects that cast them. They are hungry. They've been fasting for 80 years, waiting for a bloodline they recognize. They know the copper in your veins. They know the rhythm of your heart. It's a dinner bell to them." The flashlight flickered, the beam dying down to a dull orange ember. I shook it, the batteries rattling like teeth in a skull, a desperate, rhythmic clatter. The light snapped back to life, catching the edge of a moth-eaten curtain that swayed though there was no breeze, no breath of air in that suffocating room. The fabric was stained with something dark and blooming, a Rorschach test of old violence. The tape continued, the voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on my neck stand like wire. Rule 1. Never count the trees beyond the porch. If you count them, they realize they've been seen. And once a tree in these woods knows you've seen it, it starts to move when you blink. It starts to get closer, inch by inch, until the bark is pressing against your window pane. Rule 2. If you hear a woman sobbing by the creek, do not offer her a light. She isn't weeping for herself. She's weeping for the things she's about to do to you. She's weeping for the way your skin will feel when she peels it back like a damp orange. I felt a cold sweat break across my brow, stinging my eyes. The walls of the cabin seemed to be leaning inward, the rotting timber groaning under the pressure of the dark outside. The static on the tape flared, a white noise that felt like needles being driven into my eardrums. Silas's voice returned, but it was different now. It was layered, distorted, as if a dozen different mouths were speaking the same words in a discordant, rhythmic chant. "They aren't just hills," the voice groaned, sounding more like shifting tectonic plates than human speech. "They are mounds, burials for gods that died before the sun was warm. And you're the new watchman. But you aren't watching them to keep them in. You're watching them so they know where to find their dinner. You're the lighthouse, kid. But the light isn't for the ships. It's for the monsters beneath the waves." The flashlight died completely. I was plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt like I was buried alive, the air thick and heavy like wet wool in my throat. I fumbled with the plastic casing, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven beat against my ribs, a panicked bird in a cage of bone. I could hear the tape still spinning in the dark. Whir, click, whir. The sound of the plastic spools was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "Check the basement door," Silas whispered, his voice now sounding like it was inches from my ear, though I knew the recorder was 3 feet away. "Check the bolt. If it's sliding upward, don't try to push it back. Just run. Run until your lungs burn like lye and your feet are nothing but bloody stumps. Because if that door opens, the thing that comes out isn't Silas. It isn't your uncle. It's the void wearing his skin like a cheap, ill-fitting suit. It's the hunger of the Ozarks given a face you might trust." A scraping sound echoed from the floorboards beneath me. A slow, rhythmic dragging of something heavy and wet. My breath hitched, a jagged shard of ice in my chest. I finally got the flashlight to strike, the beam cutting through the dark to land directly on the basement door at the far end of the room. The wood was black with rot, weeping a dark fluid that pooled on the floor. The bolt was moving. It wasn't a fast movement. It was a slow, deliberate vibration, the iron sliding upward against the grain of the wood with a sound like a serrated knife on a whetstone. The tape recorder let out a high-pitched squeal of feedback that made me drop the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam sweeping across the peeling wallpaper like a searchlight in a nightmare, illuminating the decay in strobe-like flashes. I saw it then, in the corner, where the shadows were supposed to be pinned to the wall. A shape. It was taller than a man, spindly and bent, with limbs that had too many joints. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin that shimmered with the greasy sheen of a dead fish. And it was watching. I could feel its gaze like a physical heat, a searing pressure on my skin. It didn't have eyes, but it saw everything. It saw the fear in my marrow. It saw the way my blood was beginning to slow, thickening with the cold of the grave. The tape ended with a wet, gurgling pop, the sound of a bubble bursting in a swamp. The silence that rushed back in was worse than the warnings. It was a living thing, a predatory hush that seemed to swallow the sound of my own pulse. I reached for the flashlight, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely grip the cold metal. The basement door clicked open. Just an inch. A sliver of darkness deeper than the room's blackness bled out from the gap, a void within a void. A smell wafted out, the smell of old copper, wet earth, and something cloyingly sweet, like rotting peaches in the height of summer. Don't let them notice you. The echo of Silas's voice seemed to hang in the stagnant air, a ghostly afterimage of sound that vibrated in my teeth. But it was too late. I had looked. I had counted the shadows. I had listened to the voice from the grave, and in doing so, I had invited the darkness in. The Ozarks weren't just land. They were a throat, and I was sliding down toward the belly. I backed away, my boots thudding against the rot, my eyes fixed on that widening crack in the basement door. Something pale and thin, like a long, bleached finger, curled around the edge of the wood. It didn't have a fingernail. It just ended in a jagged, splintered point of bone. The flashlight flickered one last time, illuminating the creature in the corner as it took a step toward me. It didn't walk, it unfolded. It was a geometry of suffering, a jagged silhouette that defied the logic of the physical world. And then, the light went out for good. In the total, crushing dark, I heard a voice. It wasn't Silas's, and it wasn't on a tape. It was right behind me, a wet, rattling breath against the nape of my neck that smelled of the deep earth. "Welcome home," it whispered. And then the darkness began to chew. The cold wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a physical weight, a heavy, wet blanket of grave dirt air that pressed into my lungs until every breath felt like inhaling silt. That voice, that wet, rattling rasp, didn't come from the woods or the wind. It came from the 2 inches of space directly behind my ear. It felt like a serrated blade made of ice dragging across my skin. "Welcome home." The words were slick with a fluid I could hear bubbling in the speaker's throat, a sound like a punctured lung struggling for one last gasp of oxygen. Then, the darkness began to chew. It wasn't a literal bite at first. It was the sound. A rhythmic, grinding noise, like tectonic plates of bone sliding over one another. The edges of my vision, already blinded by the death of my flashlight, began to fray into something worse than black. It was a void so absolute it felt parasitic, draining the heat from my blood and the memories from my mind. I fell to my knees, my hands scrabbling in the dirt, searching for the only tether I had left to the world of the living. My fingers brushed the cold, dented plastic of the tape recorder. I gripped it like a holy relic, my knuckles white, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat for a funeral I wasn't ready to attend. I fumbled for the play button, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. The static hissed to life, a jagged explosion of white noise that felt like needles under my fingernails. For a second, the static was the only thing standing between me and the thing that breathed earth onto my neck. Then, through the crackle and the pop of the old magnetic tape, Silas's voice returned. It was thinner now, more desperate, a ghostly echo fighting its way out of a digital grave. "Rule number 3, Silas whispered, and the static flared, sounding like 1,000 locusts screaming in a burning field. "Listen close, boy, because the shadows in the Ozarks don't just hide things. They are things. Rule 3, the fire is not a light. It is a barrier. If the light dies, do not move. Do not breathe. And for the love of whatever God hasn't abandoned these hills, do not let the silence settle. The silence is how they find the shape of your soul." I froze. My lungs burned. I wanted to scream, to bolt into the obsidian moor of the timber, to run until my legs gave out or the limestone swallowed me whole. But the chewing sound was getting louder. It was coming from the periphery of the campsite, a wet, tearing noise like something heavy being dragged through raw meat. I could feel the paranoia blossoming in my gut, a black flower of dread. Every snap of a twig in the distance felt like a gunshot. Every shift of the wind felt like a hand reaching out of the dark to claim the back of my skull. I reached for my pocket, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped the small, crumpled box of matches. My hands felt like leaden weights. I struck the first match. A spark. A flash of sulfur and gold that illuminated the world for a fraction of a second. In that flicker, I saw them. They weren't animals. They weren't human. They were tall, elongated tragedies of flesh, standing just beyond the reach of the dead campfire. Their skin was the color of a drowned man's belly, translucent and stretched tight over ribs that looked like jagged limestone. They had no eyes, only deep, rotting pits that leaked a thick, black ichor. And they were smiling, wide, lipless grins that revealed rows of needle-thin teeth, vibrating with that awful, grinding, chewing sound. The match went out. The darkness returned, thicker than before, smelling of stagnant water and old, fermented rot. I heard a step, then another, a soft, squelching sound, like a boot stepping into a swamp. They were moving in. I struck another match. My thumb was raw, the skin peeling back as I fought the friction of the strike strip. The flame bloomed. They were closer. One was leaning over the remains of the fire pit, its neck elongated like a starving vulture, its head tilted at an impossible, broken angle. It was sniffing the air, its nostrils flaring as it tasted the scent of my terror. "Keep the fire hungry," Silas's voice crackled from the recorder, the static now a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with my own frantic heartbeat. It's the only thing that remembers what it's like to be alive. If the embers go cold, the void moves in. And the void is always, always hungry. You are the inheritance, boy. Not the land. The blood. They've been waiting for a new vein to tap. I didn't think. I acted on a primal, jagged instinct that bypassed my brain entirely. I reached for the pile of dry brush I'd gathered earlier, stunted oak branches and dead pine needles that felt like skeletal fingers in my grip. I shoved the match into the heart of the pile. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to lean in, the wet breath returning to the nape of my neck, the weight of the thing behind me pressing so close I could feel the cold radiating off its skin like a freezer door left ajar. Then, a spark caught. A tiny, orange eye opened in the dark. I blew on it, my breath hitching in my chest, a desperate, sobbing prayer of air. The flame licked at a pine needle, turned it to ash, and then jumped to a dry leaf. A hiss, a crackle, a sudden, violent bloom of light. The scream that tore through the woods wasn't human. It was a high-pitched, warbling shriek that sounded like metal being ground against a whetstone. The things, the pale, elongated horrors, recoiled as if the light were acid. They melted back into the shadows of the oaks, their movements fluid and unnatural, like ink dissolving in water. The one over the fire pit let out a wet, rattling hiss before it vanished, leaving behind a puddle of that black, oily bile that smoked and sizzled against the heating stones. I sat there, gasping, feeding the fire with a frantic, obsessive energy. I threw on branches, logs, anything I could find, until the flames were leaping 5 feet into the air, a roaring, orange defiance against the night. The paranoia didn't leave, though. It just changed shape. Now, I was hyper-aware of the circle of light. I knew exactly where the safety ended and the nightmare began. I could see the eyes, not the pits I'd seen before, but 1,000 tiny, reflective glints in the high canopy, watching me from the safety of the void. They were waiting. They had nothing but time. The tape was still running. The static had calmed into a low, rhythmic thrum, like the purr of a predatory cat. Silas's voice came back, but it sounded different now. There was a hollow resonance to it, a jagged edge of regret that made the hair on my arm stand up. "You think you survived Rule 3, don't you?" Silas whispered. "You think the fire is your friend. But remember this, boy, light casts a shadow. And the brighter the fire, the longer the shadow grows. Look at your feet. Look at what you've invited to sit with you." My heart stopped. I slowly, agonizingly, turned my head downward. The fire was roaring, casting a brilliant, dancing glow across the dirt of the campsite. My shadow was there, stretched out long and thin toward the edge of the woods. But it wasn't moving when I moved. I lifted my hand to wipe the sweat from my brow. My shadow stayed still. Its hand remained on the ground, its fingers elongated into talons that looked exactly like the creatures in the woods. Then, the shadow's head turned. It didn't have my profile. It had the profile of the thing with the broken neck. It leaned toward me, the black shape on the ground moving independently of my body. It reached into the pocket of my shadow jacket and pulled out a shadow recorder. I felt a cold, phantom weight leave my actual pocket. I looked down. The tape recorder was gone from my hand. It was now clutched in the grasp of the darkness at my feet. The static on the recorder, the real one, now sitting in the dirt within the shadow's grip, began to change. It wasn't white noise anymore. It was a chorus of voices. My voice, Silas's voice, and voices that sounded like they hadn't used vocal cords in a century. Rule number 4 is the hardest, Silas's voice echoed, but it wasn't coming from a tape anymore. It was coming from the ground. It was coming from my own shadow. Rule 4, never trust the reflection. Not in the water, not in the glass, and especially not in the dirt. Because sometimes, the thing that inherits the land isn't the person who walked onto it. Sometimes, the land just chooses a new shape to wear. I backed away from the fire, but the shadow followed, tethered to my heels, growing larger and more distorted with every step. The paranoia was no longer a fear of the woods. It was a fear of myself. I looked at my hands in the firelight. They looked pale. Too pale. My fingers felt longer. My joints felt like they were being pulled apart by invisible wires. I could smell it now, the scent of wet earth and copper. It wasn't coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from my own skin. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out wasn't a cry for help. It was a wet, rattling rasp, a grinding noise of bone on bone. I looked into the flickering flames, and for a split second, I saw the truth of the Ozarks. This wasn't a campground. It was a digestive system. The limestone was the teeth, the woods were the throat, and the inheritance was the bait. The darkness began to chew again, but this time, it was chewing from the inside out. I reached for the tape recorder, but my fingers wouldn't close. They were too thin, too jagged. I watched as my shadow stood up from the ground, a towering, translucent tragedy of flesh, while I felt myself thinning, stretching, becoming nothing more than a stain on the dirt. "Welcome home," I whispered to the empty air, and the voice was finally mine. It was wet. It was rattling, and it smelled of the deep, rotting earth. The fire flickered, a dying orange eye in the void, and as the last ember turned to ash, the silence finally settled. And in the silence, the Ozarks began to swallow. The darkness did not just fall, it bruised. It arrived with the weight of wet wool and the scent of a fresh grave, pressing against my lungs until every breath felt like inhaling silt. I stood there, rooted to the porch of the cabin that was now my mausoleum, listening to the sound of my own pulse. It was a frantic, irregular drumbeat, a jagged rhythm that didn't belong in the heavy, ancient silence of these hills. I looked at my hands, or where I thought my hands were. They were gone. The void had erased them. Only the sensation of the cold plastic tape recorder remained, clutched in a grip so tight my knuckles felt like they were ready to burst through the skin like bleached stones. Then came the first crack of light. It wasn't the warm glow of a distant city or the soft hum of a moonbeam. It was a violent, strobe-like seizure of the sky. The lightning was a chemical white, a magnesium flare that stripped the world of its depth and left only the terrifying, flat reality of the Ozarks. In that split second of illumination, the trees didn't look like trees. They looked like long, skeletal fingers reaching out of the black mulch, frozen in a silent scream. And they were closer. I knew they were closer. Each flash revealed a landscape that had shifted, a topography of malice that was tightening its coil around the cabin. I felt a tickle in the back of my throat. It wasn't a cough. It was a movement. It felt like a centipede made of cold oil was uncurling itself behind my tongue. I tried to swallow, but my throat was a dry, rusted pipe. When I opened my mouth to gasp for air, that voice, that wet, rattling thing that had escaped me moments ago, vibrated in the marrow of my teeth. It wasn't coming from my vocal cords. It was coming from the ground beneath the floorboards, channeled through my body like I was nothing more than a hollowed-out reed. The earth was speaking, and it used my lungs to breathe its rot. Static hissed from the tape recorder. It was a sharp, biting sound, the noise of 1,000 dead insects rubbing their legs together. Through the white noise, Silas's voice returned, but it was different now. It was distorted, slowed down until every syllable sounded like a heavy stone being dragged over glass. Do not look at the gaps between the trunks, the tape wheezed. The gaps are where the hunger hides. If the lightning shows you the pale thing, do not acknowledge the symmetry. The Ozarks do not do symmetry. If it has 2 eyes, it is looking for a way in. If it has more, it is already home. Another flash. The world turned into a negative photograph. Black sky, white woods, And there, standing at the edge of the clearing where the fire had just died, was the symmetry Silas warned about. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like the grey, peeling skin of a birch tree. But it wasn't bark. It was translucent, wet, and stretched over a frame of obsidian bone. It had a face that was merely a suggestion of a face, a smooth, featureless oval bifurcated by a vertical slit that wept a thick, dark ichor. And it had eyes. Far too many eyes. They were clustered like fish eggs along its collarbone, each one a milky, lidless marble reflecting the strobe light agony of the storm. I backed away, my boots scuffing against the grid of the porch. The silence that followed the lightning was louder than the thunder. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that makes your ears bleed. I could hear the thing moving, even though it didn't make a sound. I could hear the air displacing around it. I could hear the way the grass died as its shadow touched the blades. The smell hit me then, the stench of a cellar that had been flooded with stagnant river water and left to fester for a century. It was the smell of the deep, black veins of the world, where the sun had never reached. The next flash showed it at the bottom of the steps. It was hunched now, its long, many-jointed limbs folding in ways that defied biology. It looked like a spider trying to wear the skin of a man. The eyes on its chest were all focused on me, shimmering with a dull, predatory intelligence. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers sliding over the metal. It was slick. Everything was becoming slick. The wood of the cabin was weeping sap that smelled of iron. The very structure I had inherited was returning to the primal soup of the forest, dissolving into the mulch and the rot. Inside. I had to get inside. I slammed the door and threw the bolt, the sound echoing like a gunshot in a cathedral. I pressed my back against the wood, listening. Nothing. Just the wind through the pines, a low, mourning sound that seemed to mock my terror. Then, a soft, rhythmic thud. 1, 2, 3. Something was knocking, but not on the door. It was knocking on the floorboards directly beneath my feet. The tape recorder in my hand chirped, a sudden burst of high-frequency static that made me drop it. It hit the floor and the wheel spun, the tape spooling out like a black, shiny intestine. Silas's voice was a frantic whisper now, barely audible over the sound of something scratching at the wood below. It wants the marrow, the tape hissed. It doesn't want your blood. It wants the memories stored in the bone. It wants the history of the marrow. Give it the recorder. Give it the sound of a dead man. Maybe it will mistake the magnetic ghost for the living meat. I stared at the recorder. The scratching was getting louder, the sound of long, obsidian claws peeling back the cedar planks. The strobe lightning flickered through the gaps in the window shutters, casting rhythmic bars of light across the room. Flash. The floorboards were bulging upward. Flash. A splintered hole appeared, and a pale, wet finger, long as a branch, poked through. It had no nail, just a sharpened point of calcified bone. It felt around the air, tasting the vibrations of my fear. I didn't think. I kicked the tape recorder toward the hole. The machine was still whirring, Silas's voice repeating a single, garbled word over and over. Inherit. 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 The pale finger hooked around the plastic casing. With a violent, wet yank, the recorder was pulled down into the darkness beneath the house. For a moment, there was a terrible, cacophonous sound, the sound of plastic being crushed, of magnetic tape being devoured, and a high-pitched, warbling scream that wasn't human and wasn't animal. It was the sound of the void being fed. The scratching stopped. The pressure in the air vanished. The smell of rot retreated, replaced by the neutral, cold scent of the storm. I slumped against the wall, my breath coming in ragged, shivering gasps. The lightning continued to strobe, but the clearing was empty. The birch skin thing was gone. The forest looked like a forest again, albeit a cruel and indifferent one. But as I sat there in the dark, waiting for the dawn that felt a million years away, I realized the silence wasn't quite total. I could still hear Silas. Not from the tape recorder. It was gone. I could hear him in the walls. I could hear him in the way the wind rattled the shingles. And then I felt it. A cold, heavy weight in my own chest. I reached up and touched my throat. My skin felt different. It felt tough. It felt like bark. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, a thick, black ichor began to drip from my lips, staining the floorboards. The inheritance wasn't the land. It wasn't the cabin. It was the debt. The Ozarks don't just swallow, they digest. And as the next flash of lightning filled the room, I looked at my reflection in the dark window glass. I didn't have two eyes anymore. I had a cluster of milky, lidless marbles beginning to sprout along my collarbone. The voice was finally mine, and it was the sound of the deep, rotting earth, waiting for the next owner to arrive. The breach was complete. The midnight had moved inside me, and the void was finally, terrifyingly, at home. I settled into the shadows, my many-jointed limbs folding with a wet, sickening click, and I waited. I waited for the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. I waited for the next soul to claim what was left of me. Through the vertical slit now opening in my face, I watched the storm, a silent sentinel in a landscape of hunger, perfectly symmetrical at last. The ground beneath the campground did not just hold the weight of the pines and the rusted trailers, it breathed. I could feel the respiration through the soles of my boots, a rhythmic, subterranean thrum that resonated in my marrow. The storm outside was a distant memory, a flicker of lightning muffled by the suffocating density of the earth. I was no longer standing on the porch. I was descending. The vertical slit in my face, that jagged tear where my identity used to reside, didn't hurt. It hummed. It drank in the air, filtering the scent of ancient dampness and something sweet, the cloying, heavy odor of rot turned to honey. I reached for the tape recorder in my pocket. My fingers felt elongated, the joints clicking with a dry, wooden percussion. I pressed play. The static was different now. It wasn't just white noise, it was a chorus. The voice of the previous owner, Miller, came through like a ghost struggling to speak through a throat full of silt. He said, "Do not look for the source of the glow. If you see the pale green light rising through the cracks in the limestone, bury it. Cover it with salt. Cover it with your own blood if you have to, but do not let it touch your eyes. It is not light. It is an appetite. It is the nervous system of the mountain reaching out to see if you are ripe." I ignored him. I had to. The symmetry demanded it. I followed the trail behind the main cabin, where the roots of the ancient oaks twisted like the limbs of drowning giants. The earth here was soft, yielding like bruised fruit. And then I saw it. The bioluminescence. It wasn't a steady radiance. It pulsed. A sickly, radioactive emerald that clung to the undersides of the ferns and mapped the veins of the moss. It cast no shadows, only a flat, terrifying clarity that stripped the world of its depth. The fungus grew in clusters of translucent bells, swaying in a wind that didn't exist. As I walked, my boots crushed them, releasing a cloud of spores that hung in the air like frozen static. Each breath I took felt like inhaling fine, glass needles. They settled in my lungs. They began to knit. I found the entrance to the sinkhole near the edge of the property, a jagged moor lined with limestone teeth. The glow was coming from deep within, a churning vortex of light that promised an end to the solitude. I climbed down, my new anatomy making the descent effortless. My limbs moved with a predatory grace I hadn't possessed when I was merely human. The rock was cold, but the air grew warmer, more humid, smelling of copper and wet fur. The walls of the cavern were draped in mycelium. It wasn't just mold, it was a tapestry of nerves. Thousands of thin, white threads pulsed with that same green fire, connecting the ceiling to the floor in a web of living electricity. And in the center of the chamber, I saw what lived beneath. It wasn't a monster in the way the stories describe. There were no claws, no fangs. It was a mass, a colossal, undulating mound of pale, translucent flesh and fungal bloom that filled the cavern. It looked like a brain that had outgrown its skull, a hive of soft, wet tissue that rippled with every beat of the mountain's heart. Faces were embedded in its surface, scores of them. They weren't screaming. They were peaceful. Their eyes were gone, replaced by the same glowing mushrooms that now carpeted the floor. I recognized Miller. His face was near the base, half submerged in the mass, his mouth open in a permanent, silent O. The tape recorder in my hand let out a final, high-pitched squeal and died. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the wet, rhythmic throb of the entity. I approached the mass. The vertical slit in my face began to vibrate, a sympathetic frequency that bridged the gap between my consciousness and the void. I understood then. The campground wasn't an inheritance. It was a harvest. The Ozarks were a digestive system, and I was the latest enzyme. The creature reached out. A single thread of mycelium, as thin as a hair but glowing with the intensity of a dying star, drifted toward me. It touched the opening in my face. There was no pain, only a sudden, violent expansion of my senses. I could feel the trees above me. I could feel the worms churning the soil 3 miles away. I could feel the next car turning onto the gravel driveway, miles down the road, the driver's heart beating with a frantic, delicious rhythm. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a sentinel. I was the bridge between the sun-scorched world of the living and the cold, eternal hunger of the deep. The light swallowed me. The green glow filled my vision until there was no distinction between my body and the rock, between my thoughts and the spores. I felt my bones soften, turning into the same supple, chitinous material as the fungal bells. I leaned back into the mass, the cool, wet flesh of the mountain welcoming me home. The vertical slit closed, then opened again, wider this time. I waited. I waited for the sound of tires on the gravel. I waited for the next soul to claim what was left of the property. I would be here, beneath the floorboards, beneath the roots, beneath the very concept of mercy. I would be the glow they couldn't ignore. I would be the warning they couldn't hear. The Ozarks don't just have hills. They have throats. And I am the tongue that licks the teeth. Down here, in the bioluminescent dark, the symmetry is perfect. The rot is beautiful. The hunger is holy. I watched through the earth as the new owner stepped out of his car, his keys jingling like a funeral bell. He looked at the cabin with hope. He looked at the woods with wonder. He didn't see the pale green light bleeding through the grass at his feet. He will press play on the recorder I left for him. He will hear my voice, distorted by the silt and the static. He will listen to the warnings, and he will ignore them, just as I did. Because the light is too beautiful to resist, and the void is too lonely to be left empty. I am the previous owner now, and I am waiting. I am perfectly symmetrical. I am the silence in the storm. I am what lives beneath. The spores began to drift upward, rising through the vents of the cabin, settling into the carpet, the bedding, the very air he breathed. Each fleck of green was a promise. Each vibration of the mountain was an invitation. I felt his first breath of the tainted air. I felt the spores hitch a ride in his blood. I smiled, though I no longer had lips to form the shape. The cycle was beginning again. The hunger was moving. The mountain was feeding. And as the sun set over the Ozarks, casting long, jagged shadows across the valley, the only light left was the one that didn't belong to the sky. It was the glow from below, the sickly, emerald heartbeat of a landscape that had finally found its voice. Welcome to the campground. Stay as long as you like. You're never truly leaving. The grey dawn didn't break over the Ozarks so much as it bruised them. It was a cold, suffocating light that bled through the canopy, illuminating the skeletal reaches of the white oaks and the heavy, moisture-laden mist that clung to the valley floor like a burial shroud. There was no warmth in the sunrise, only the clinical exposure of everything that was rotting. I sat on the porch of the ranger station, my fingers numb as they curled around the plastic casing of the Realistic CTR-15 tape recorder. The plastic felt oily, impregnated with the sweat and fear of the man who had sat here before me. I pressed play, and the static that hissed from the tiny, dust-choked speaker sounded like dry bone grinding against dry bone. It was the sound of the void clearing its throat. The voice of my uncle, or whatever was left of him when he recorded this, was a jagged ruin. It was a sound stripped of its marrow, a thin, rattling vibrato that competed with the rhythmic thrum of the emerald heartbeat coming from the sinkhole behind the bathhouse. He didn't sound like a man who had inherited a business. He sounded like a man who had inherited a terminal diagnosis. Don't look at the trees when the mist turns the color of a bruised lung, the tape hissed. The magnetic ribbon groaned, struggling to hold onto the weight of his warning. If you see the shadows stretching toward the glow, you've already stayed too long. But you won't leave. You can't. The soil here isn't dirt, kid. It's an appetite. It's a great, yawning hunger lined with limestone teeth and cedar hair, and now it knows your name. It's tasted your footsteps. I looked down at my boots. They were stained with the red clay of the hollow, a deep, ferret crimson that looked too much like dried blood in the grey light. The despair didn't come as a wave. It came as a slow, freezing tide, inching up my shins, turning my blood to slush. I had come here thinking of property values and timber rights, of a quiet life away from the static of the city. I didn't realize the static followed the land. I didn't realize the static was the primary language of the Ozarks. I stood up, my knees popping with a sound like snapping kindling. The air tasted of wet iron and ozone. I walked toward the edge of the clearing, toward the place where the emerald light was strongest. It pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic consistency, a bioluminescent throb that suggested something massive and wet was breathing just beneath the limestone crust. This wasn't the green of spring or the green of life. It was the green of a stagnant pond, the green of copper corrosion, the green of a corpse's eyes reflecting a dying star. The campground was a graveyard of failed intentions. Rusted airstreams sat half-swallowed by blackberry briars, their aluminum skins pockmarked and peeling like sunburnt flesh. The picnic tables were slick with a black, oily fungus that seemed to writhe when the light hit it. Everything was leaning. The trees leaned toward the sinkhole. The cabin leaned toward the earth. Even the shadows seemed to have a weight to them, dragging across the gravel with a physical friction that set my teeth on edge. The tape clicked, a heavy, mechanical thud that echoed in the silence of the dawn. The voice returned, lower now, almost a whisper. "It's the passing of the torch," he said. "That's what they call it. But it's not a torch. It's a tether. You're the new anchor. You're the one who keeps the emerald from spilling over into the rest of the world. You feed it your days, and in return, it lets you watch the sun go down. But the sun never really rises here, does it? It just gets a little less dark." I reached the edge of the sinkhole. The earth here had fallen away in a perfect, jagged circle, exposing the ribs of the world. Layers of ancient rock, compressed by eons of silence, looked down into a pit of pulsing, radiant bile. The emerald glow didn't just illuminate the dark, it carved it. It revealed the things that shouldn't be seen, the way the roots of the trees didn't go down, but reached out like fingers, weaving into a net of pale, translucent silk, the way the rocks seemed to be translucent, revealing the slow, churning movement of a dark fluid within them. The smell was the worst part. It was the scent of a cellar that had been closed since the dawn of man. It was the smell of wet fur, of old copper pennies, and the cloying, sweet rot of a fallen deer. It was the smell of the void exhaling. I felt a sudden, violent urge to jump, to just let the gravity of the place claim what the deed said I owned. If I were part of the soil, I wouldn't have to listen to the tapes. I wouldn't have to watch the shadows detach themselves from the trees and crawl toward the light. But I couldn't move. My feet were heavy, anchored by a sudden, crushing realization. My uncle hadn't left me this place because he loved me. He had left it to me because he was tired. He was an old man whose soul had been eroded by the emerald pulse until there was nothing left but a hollow shell, a human-shaped vessel for the static. He had passed me the torch so he could finally step into the dark and stop feeling the heartbeat. The tape reached its end. The plastic reel spun fruitlessly, a frantic, rhythmic slapping sound that mimicked a dying heart. Click, click, click. I looked back at the ranger station. The cold, grey light of the dawn made it look like a tombstone. I saw a figure standing in the window. For a moment, my heart seized, a cold fist clamping down on my lungs. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bent at angles that defied the natural geometry of bone. It wasn't my uncle. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was just a shape, a shadow that had forgotten how to be a person, silhouetted against the sickly green light that was now leaking through the floorboards of the cabin. It raised a hand. A long, jagged gesture that might have been a wave or a benediction. Or a warning. I realized then that the warnings on the tape weren't meant to help me survive. They were the instructions for my interment. The rules of the campground were the rules of a cage. Stay on the path. Don't look at the sky. Don't listen to the screaming in the pines. These weren't tips for a long life. They were the protocols for a slow consumption. The emerald light flared, a brilliant, nauseating spike of color that turned the gray dawn into a neon nightmare. The ground beneath me shivered. I could feel the limestone shifting, the hollow spaces beneath the Ozarks groaning as they settled into new configurations. The campground wasn't just land. It was a machine. A vast, subterranean engine fueled by the despair of whoever held the deed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare cassette I had found in the desk. I knew what I had to do. I had to record. I had to document the rot. I had to weave my own voice into the magnetic static so that the next person, the next poor soul in the bloodline, would have something to listen to while they watched their life dissolve into the mist. I pressed record. The silence of the woods rushed in to fill the tape. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat felt like it was filled with wet wool. I looked at my hands. In the emerald light, my veins looked black, snaking under my skin like the roots of the hemlock trees. I wasn't the owner anymore. I was the property. The first word I managed to speak was a jagged thing, torn from a throat that already felt like it belonged to a ghost. "Welcome," I whispered. The word hung in the cold, grey air, flat and lifeless. The emerald pulse intensified, a rhythmic thud that I could now feel in my marrow. It was a heartbeat. It was my heartbeat. The valley and I were becoming one singular, rotting entity. "Stay as long as you like," I continued, my voice gaining a hollow, resonant quality that I didn't recognize. The despair was no longer a weight, it was a flaw. I had fallen as far as I could go, and now I was simply part of the foundation. I looked out over the jagged shadows of the Ozarks, watching the mist swallow the last of the grey dawn. The trees were no longer trees. They were the bars of a cell that stretched to the horizon. "You're never truly leaving." The tape hissed, drinking in the sound of my submission. Somewhere in the distance, a screech owl cried out, a sound like a woman screaming in a dream. But it wasn't an owl. It was just the land, finally finding its voice through me. I sat back down on the porch, the Realistic CTR-15 heavy in my lap, and waited for the night to return. The emerald light flickered, a sickly, welcoming hearth for a home that was a grave. I closed my eyes, but the green was still there, burned into my retinas, a permanent stain on the void. The torch had been passed. The flame was cold, and the static was the only thing left to hear. The air grew colder, if that were possible, a biting, dry chill that seemed to sap the very moisture from my eyes. I watched a patch of moss on the porch railing. In the emerald glow, it didn't look like a plant. It looked like a colony of tiny, translucent lungs, breathing in unison with the sinkhole. Everything here was an imitation of life, a gothic parody of the natural world. The rocks were too soft, the wood was too hard, and the silence was too loud. I thought about the town, 20 miles down the winding, gravel throat of the mountain road. They knew. They must have known. The way the clerk at the hardware store had looked at me when I mentioned the old Miller place, that quick, darting glance, the way his hand had trembled as he counted out my change. It wasn't pity. It was relief. It was the look of a man who had seen a debt transferred to someone else's account. I was the payment. The Ozarks are old. Older than the Appalachians, older than the memories of the people who haunt them. They are a crumpled, broken landscape of hidden caves and secret waters, a place where the earth has folded in on itself so many times that it's trapped things from the basement of time. And here, at the heart of this campground, one of those things was waking up. Or maybe it had never been asleep. Maybe it was just slow. A slow, grinding intelligence that measured its life in centuries and its meals in generations. I looked at the tape recorder again. The red light of the record function was a tiny, bleeding eye in the gloom. I realized I was still talking, my voice a rhythmic drone that matched the pulsing light from the pit. "The rules are simple," I heard myself say, though I didn't remember thinking the words. "Don't count the campers. If you count them, you might notice the ones that aren't standing on the ground. Don't look in the mirrors after midnight. The reflection is just a suggestion, and the thing behind the glass is getting impatient. And whatever you do, don't try to fill the sinkhole. It's not a hole. It's a mouth. And it's already tasted you." A sudden, sharp movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. One of the rusted airstreams creaked, its metal door swinging open on hinges that screamed like a dying animal. Something stepped out. It was pale, the color of a fish's belly, and its limbs were too long, its joints moving with a fluid, sickening grace. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin that caught the emerald light like a mirror. It didn't approach. It just stood there, swaying slightly, a jagged silhouette against the grey mist. Then, another one stepped out from behind a cedar tree, and another from the shadows of the bathhouse. They were the campers, the ones who had stayed as long as they liked, the ones who had never truly left. They weren't ghosts. Ghosts are memories. These were leftovers. The husks of people who had been hollowed out by the emerald heartbeat until there was nothing left but the static. They were the witnesses my uncle had mentioned in the scribbled notes I'd found in the glove box. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The despair they radiated was a physical force, a heavy, crushing pressure that made my lungs ache. They were the chorus to my solo, the silent background radiation of the campground's long, slow decay. I felt a strange, detached sense of peace. The struggle was over. The fight against the inheritance, the attempt to make sense of the warnings, the hope of escape, it was all just noise. The reality was the emerald glow. The reality was the static. The reality was the jagged, grey dawn that would never quite become a day. I reached out and pressed the stop button on the recorder. The sudden silence was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from the porch. The pale figures in the clearing didn't move. They were waiting. They were patient. They had all the time in the world, because time didn't work the same way here. Here, time was just a circle, a loop of magnetic tape playing the same scream over and over again. I stood up and walked toward the door of the ranger station. My movements felt heavy, scripted. I went inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and sat behind the scarred oak desk. I opened the drawer and found a fresh cassette. I labeled it with my name and the date. The torch was passed. I looked out the window at the cold, grey world. The emerald light was fading now, retreating back into the throat of the earth, leaving behind a landscape that looked like a charcoal drawing left out in the rain. The despair was no longer an emotion, it was my skin. I reached for the tape recorder and placed it in the center of the desk, right where my uncle had left it for me. I knew that soon, someone else would drive up that winding gravel road. Someone with a deed and a dream of a quiet life. And when they arrived, I wouldn't be here. Not really. I'd be just another jagged shadow in the mist, another pale shape swaying in the emerald glow, waiting for the next voice to add to the static. The dawn was fully grey now, a flat, featureless expanse of sky that promised nothing but more of the same. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, listening to the silence of the Ozarks. It was a beautiful, terrible sound. The sound of a void that had finally found its voice. And as I drifted into the cold, grey sleep of the inherited, the last thing I heard was the faint, mechanical click of a tape recorder that wasn't there, turning itself on to record the sound of my breathing. Welcome to the campground. Stay as long as you like. You're never truly leaving.